Hey, what's up, y'all? Thanks for joining me on part one of my deep dive into the history of slavery. I'm not sure how many episodes there's going to be, but I do know that we'll go an extended amount of time so we can cover this topic, a topic that is often used to divide us as a nation, as a society in general. So, in today's episode, or in part one, we'll be discussing this vital history. We'll be working our way through some documents, some writings of Thomas Sowell. If you're not familiar with the book Black Rednecks and White Liberals, I highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with this information because I'm telling you, it's no exaggeration, y'all. The information that I've gained over the more recent years, over the last probably say 6 years or so, probably a little more, actually, probably around 9 years, I would say, have been life changing. So, without further ado, we're going to jump right in. The video is courtesy of a YouTube channel called Soul Explains, the title of the YouTube channel, Soul Explains. There's a link in the comment section if you're catching the replay. So again, without further ado, we're going to play some of the content. I'll let some of the videos go, and then I'll pause it. I don't want there to be any copyright issues. I'll pause it, and then I'll just kind of share my thoughts on each topic, and then we'll just kind of let it go. But again, this will probably be an extended video. I'm hoping so we can really dive deep. So again, let's jump right in.
Slavery was an evil of greater scope and magnitude than most people imagine. And as a result, its place in history is radically different from the way it is usually portrayed. And immediately the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants enslaved by Europeans and their descendants in the southern United States, or at most, Africans enslaved by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. No other historic horror is so narrowly construed. No one thinks of war, famine, or decimating epidemics in such localized terms. These are afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race all over the planet, and so was slavery. Had slavery been limited to one race in one country during 3 centuries, its tragedies would not have been 1/10 the magnitude that they were in fact. Why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? Often, it is those who are most critical of a Eurocentric view of the world who are most Eurocentric when it comes to the evils and failings of the human race. Why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for thousands of years?
I think he makes a really good point. It's pretty interesting, and this will be a point that I'll kind of hit on throughout the course of this series. But it's a point that needs to be emphasized. Why is it that although slavery has existed basically since the dawn of man, since man was created, yet we, or the critics, especially the critics of the West, critics of the United States, we seem to only want to focus, or they seem to only want to focus on the aspects of slavery that involve white folks. Considering how broad a scope, if you look at the world history of slavery, how broad a scope that covers, just only looking at a few 100-year period where people were enslaved here in the United States is kind of being very narrow-minded, being very limited. Well, you would be better off looking at it from a much broader perspective. And the things that we're going to learn, I'm telling y'all, I keep saying it, but the things that we're going to learn over the course of this series, mind-blowing. Let's proceed.
Unless it was not this evil itself that was the real concern, but rather the present-day uses of that historic evil. Clearly, the ability to score ideological points against American society or Western civilization, or to induce guilt and thereby extract benefits from the white population today, are greatly enhanced by making enslavement appear to be a peculiarly American or a peculiarly white crime.
He's on point. Again, on point. Slavery is not a white evil. It is not an American evil. Slavery is an evil of man, period. There's just no debating that. It is something that has been existed long before the United States, long before England came into existence, long before they were thought of.
This explanation is also consistently used by those who pass over in utter silence the traumas of slavery that still exist in Mauritania, the Sudan, and parts of Nigeria and Benin. Why so concerned for dead people who are now beyond our help than for living human beings suffering the burdens and humiliations of slavery today? Why does a verbal picture of the abuses of slaves in centuries past arouse far more response than contemporary photographs of present-day slaves in Time magazine?
I'm hoping this connection is good, y'all. If the connection is good, let me know. But how many of the modern day critics of the West actually talk about slavery, the ongoing slavery in Africa, the ongoing slavery in the Middle East, the enslavement of people, different people groups that go on in China? How many of them actually discuss this issue? I don't know. I don't think I've ever heard anyone. You take these social justice warriors in the NBA. Take your Steve Kerrs, the guys who are so critical of the racist issues here in the United States, acting as if we still live in 1960s Selma, Alabama. Take those guys, for instance. They're quick to talk about the ails and ills of the United States and the West. And Lord knows there are many. However, when you reference China, especially those NBA guys, what's the guy's name who coaches the San Antonio Spurs? His name just I'm drawing a blank on his name. Please help me in the comment section. But you take him, for instance, very critical, him and Steve Kerr, very critical of the United States and the history of the United States and vilifying the U.S. for racism. But when you mention China, crickets, absolute crickets. This doesn't make sense. I mean, I get it. Excuse me, I get it. I know there's a political agenda. Like in the comments, Lon said, you have to think of the bigger picture. It's always an agenda at hand. You can never deny that.
The New York Times or the National Geographic. It takes no more research than a trip to almost any public library or college library to show the incredibly lopsided coverage of slavery in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere as compared to the meager writings on the even larger number of Africans enslaved in the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa, not to mention the vast numbers of Europeans also enslaved in centuries past in the Islamic world.
What I know is that growing up, I don't think I ever heard of any reference to the ongoing issue of slavery. Now, that could be that my teachers were just unaware. That's very possible. But I never heard anyone talk about slavery that still goes on in Africa or in the Middle East. I never heard about any of that. I never heard about the great pains that the United States, and we're going to get into all this, and I don't want to give it away if you're not familiar, but the great pains that the United States, the West, the people in England, as evil as it was that they were a major part of the transatlantic slave trade, but ultimately going through great pains, to end slavery or to seek to end slavery worldwide. I'm telling you, when we get to that section, if you're unfamiliar with it, you'll be blown away. Literally.
And within Europe itself, at least 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African pirates alone from 1500 to 1800. And some European slaves were still being sold on the auction block in Egypt, years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed blacks in the United States. Indeed, an Anglo-Egyptian treaty of August 4, 1877, prohibited the continued sale of white slaves after August 3, 1885, as well as prohibiting the import and export of Sudanese and Abyssinian slaves. During the Middle Ages, Slavs were so widely used as slaves in both Europe and the Islamic world that the very word slave derived from the word for Slav, not only in English, but also in other European languages, as well as in Arabic. Nor have Asians or Polynesians been exempt from either being enslaved or enslaving others.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but Slavs, I think that they're more light skinned, fair skinned, if I'm not mistaken. And they were enslaved to such a degree to where that's where the term came from.
China, in centuries past, has been described as one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world. Slavery was also common in India, where it has been estimated that there were more slaves than in the entire Western Hemisphere, and where the original thugs kidnapped children for the purpose of enslavement.
A lot of what we're dealing with today, the entire issue with the Sound of Freedom movie, how that's being stifled by many in the mainstream media. There's always a bigger picture, y'all. I'll probably end up saying that 100 times as this progresses, but it's pretty wild.
In some of the cities of Southeast Asia, slaves were a majority of the population.
Mm.
Slavery was also an established institution in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus's ships ever appeared on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire regularly enslaved a percentage of the young boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and assigned them to various duties in the civil or military establishment.
Now, we're not done. We're going to move on to the next video. We're definitely not done today. Part 2, or section 2, part 1.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East.
That pretty much flies in the face of much of what we see as the entire modern slave narrative, that it was all about race. Now, no one's denying that race ultimately played a role in the slave trade, particularly the transatlantic slave trade. That's how many of the slaveholders were attempting to justify their holding a man against his will, against his free, against not allowing him to be free. They sought to justify that by dehumanizing them for their skin color, saying that they're less than human, saying that they're savages, so on and so forth. But the vast majority of times, it seemed to be there were just warring tribes, and many times they looked like each other, the people that did the enslaving.
For at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere.
Let me rewind that.
Before the modern era, by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe.
Bottom line, people, the evil that lies in the heart, the fallen nature of man, will find a way to divide and find a way to look at somebody as less than for whatever reason. That's just the unfortunate nature of our sinful hearts.
The Europeans who were enslaved in North Africa were despised and abused because they were Christians in a Muslim region of the world, where they were called Christian dogs. Race became the most visible difference between slaves and slave owners in the Western Hemisphere. As distinguished historian Daniel J. Borston put it, now for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with a difference of race. To make racism the driving force behind slavery is to make a historically recent factor the cause of an institution which originated thousands of years
Excellent
earlier.
point.
This enshrinement of racism as an overarching causal factor accords far more with current instrumental agendas than with history. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by
Listen to
Alex
this, y'all.
Haley.
Listen to this.
Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by."
I gotta sit on this for a second. I remember when Roots came out. I'm 53. When Roots came out, I think I was in the second grade. And we're talking about 1978-ish, 77, somewhere around then. And I dealt with a lot of racism. Anyone who's even remotely familiar with my channel, you know that that's something I talk about. I dealt with a lot of racism in my lifetime. Being called the N-word, having my car spray painted, being threatened to get beaten up, having so-called friends mocking me because of my skin color as a young man, and particularly up until I was about, I would say probably the sixth grade or seventh grade is when it stopped. But then when I lived in Indiana, went through a whole another series, which is a story in and of itself, where I dealt with a ton of racism out there from all sides. Let me make that abundantly clear. From people that looked like me, from people that looked nothing like me. I got hate because of my skin color. I'm just keeping it 100 with y'all. But back to my main point. I remember seeing Roots when I was a kid and dealing with all the hate just for, being Black that I dealt with. Watching Roots had me so angry, so angry. I remember going to school as a little boy and just looking at the white kids and just having such disdain towards them. I'm thankful that my mom and dad, I know my dad for a fact dealt with racism. He didn't really talk about it a whole heck of a lot growing up in South Carolina. When he died in 2003, he was 93 years old. So he definitely saw the ugliness living through Jim Crow laws and all the stuff that he dealt with growing up. But he didn't really teach us how to hate, to be racist. It just wasn't what he did. And my mom's experience, the things that she went through, she said it was never really a prevalent thing that she dealt with growing up, pretty much throughout her life. She was honest and real enough to know that it did exist. And she did deal with some, most likely throughout her older life, but it wasn't something that she constantly brought up. So when I had all that anger and hatred in my heart towards white folks, it wasn't something that lasted a while because I just wasn't taught that. It wasn't instilled in my head. So as I got older and then I just started seeing people who looked like me and people who didn't, Black, white, brown, Asian, who showed love and respect towards me and appreciated me, it never really became an issue. And I thank God for that. I truly thank God for that I didn't walk around with all that hate in my heart, despite the things that I dealt with as a young man. But Roots, I'm telling you, that movie had me going. Definitely had me going.
This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. First is the objection to falsification itself, that the damage which this does to the general level of understanding and trust in a society is incalculable, and can easily outweigh, in its long-run consequences especially, any immediate good that might be expected from an expedient taking of liberties with the truth. Second, even the short-run benefits are by no means clear. Has a sense of special grievance helped advance any people? Or has what happened in centuries past been a distraction and an incitement to counterproductive strife, much as territorial irredentism has been? Rather than debate current ideological agendas, we can try to determine what we can about the actual history of slavery, including how it ended. No institution of comparable age and worldwide scope has ever disappeared. over almost the entire planet, leaving so little awareness of how and why it vanished, or so little interest in that question.
Man, I'm telling you, another great question, Mr. Soul, Dr. Soul brings up. Slavery, of course, we know it still exists. There's no question. That was part of his opening monologue, so to speak, or intro, that it's still going on today. And he questioned why some people who are so hell bent, for lack of a better word, on dredging up the ugly, uh, our country's ugly history, the West's ugly history, seem to have such little concern for modern slavery. I'm not saying we should ignore our history. Of course, we should talk about it. We should absolutely talk about it. But it would seem that if we are truly passionate about ending slavery and all of its evils, that we would have a concern for what went on in the past and perhaps an even greater concern about what's happening right now. Wouldn't you think? Just my thoughts.
Volumes continue to be published about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which, for all its greatness, did not encompass 1/10 as much of the world as the institution of slavery did. Archaeologists continue to excavate the ruins of ancient civilizations in Central America and the Middle East, while military historians pour through archives and examine ancient weapons to try to piece together the history of warfare. Yet remarkably little is written about one of the most momentous moral dramas in the history of the human species, the bitter worldwide struggle which lasted for more than a century to destroy the elaborate systems and institutions for the ownership and sale of human beings. While there is a sizable literature on the American Civil War, for all its staggering carnage and historic legacy within the United States, in an international perspective, it is only a small and highly atypical part of the story of the worldwide crusade against slavery. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved. Far from being targeted by Europeans for racial reasons, as some have claimed, Africa was resorted to as a source of large supplies of slaves only after centuries of Europeans enslaving other Europeans had been brought to an end by the consolidation of nations and empires on the European continent, by internal shifts from slavery to serfdom in much of Europe, and by the Catholic Church's pressures against enslaving fellow Christians, which was by no means the same as the Church's saying that slavery, as such, was wrong.
I really appreciate the fact that he points out the errors and the flaws within the nation, within our society. He's not trying to say that these people were angelic beings who came down and wanted all the slaves freed. He points out that slavery was in existence for a long time before anyone really stepped in to make an impact. But he also points out or calls into question who were the ones who were the primary motivators or instigators, and why is it that so few people seem to actually want to know the answer to that question?
Similar consolidation of political units in parts of Asia led to a decline of slavery in those realms. While began to develop in 18th century Britain, at a time when the British overseas colonies in the Western Hemisphere depended on slaves. Here again, the baffling present-day disregard of an international saga of strife, full of individual dramas as well as historic consequences, seems explicable only in terms of today's ideological agendas. While slavery was common to all civilizations, as well as to peoples considered uncivilized, only one civilization developed a moral revulsion against it, very late in its history: Western civilization. Today, it seems so obvious that, as Abraham Lincoln said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But the hard fact is that for thousands of years, slavery was simply not an issue, even among the great religious thinkers or moral philosophers of civilizations around the world. We may wonder why it took 18 centuries after the Sermon on the Mount for Christians to develop an anti-slavery movement. But a more profound question is why not even the leading moralists in other civilizations rejected slavery at all.
And again, and yet somehow the West has been blamed and looked upon as being the worst of the worst when it comes to the issue of slavery.
There is no evidence, according to a scholarly study, that slavery came under serious attack in any part of the world before the 18th century. That is when it first came under attack in Europe. Themselves the leading slave traders of the 18th century, Europeans nevertheless became, in the 19th century, the destroyers of slavery around the world.
I got to rewind that. I literally have to rewind that. I really want that to be heard. I want people to hear that. Who became the destroyers of slavery around the world?
That is when it first came under attack in Europe. Themselves the leading slave traders of the 18th century, Europeans nevertheless became, in the 19th century, the destroyers of slavery around the world, not just in European societies or European offshoot societies overseas, but in non-European societies as well, over the bitter opposition of Africans, Arabs, Asians, and others. Moreover, within Western civilization, the principal impetus for the abolition of slavery came first from very conservative religious activists, people who would today be called the religious right.
Okay, I got to rewind that as well. The villains of the West, the conservative Christian, the one everybody wants to hate on half the time, were what was their role in the end? In the abolishment or the abolition of
but
slavery?
in non-European societies as well, over the bitter opposition of Africans, Arabs, Asians, and others. Moreover, within Western civilization, the principal impetus for the abolition of slavery came first from very conservative religious activists, people who would today be called the religious right. Clearly, this story is not politically correct in today's terms.
Say that
Hence,
again.
it is ignored, as if it never happened.
My goodness. My goodness, y'all. We're going to hit up one more section for today. I hope y'all appreciating this and enjoying this. It's just very interesting what really went down, and the role whites, Europeans, the church, other nations, other ethnic nations.
Slavery did not die out quietly of its own.
Hold on, y'all. Yeah, but it's pretty amazing the role other nations played in trying to promote slavery. It was indoctrinating
To the bitter end, and it lost only because
it was a product, or a part of an integral part of a lot of cultures: African cultures, Arabic cultures, Chinese, India. And when the white folks, the Europeans, the Americans came around saying that slavery should be ended, not discounting their role in the slave trade. So make sure you hear me on that. I'm not discounting their role. There were plenty of evils that were done in support of slavery. Absolutely. But once eyes started being opened and people started seeing slavery for the evil that it is, who were the ones who played a major role in getting rid of it? Europeans, Western Europeans, Americans, Christians, conservative-minded Christians. It's a fact of history, like it or not.
Europeans had gunpowder weapons first. The advance of European imperialism around the world marked the retreat of the slave trade and then of slavery itself. The British stamped out slavery, not only throughout the British Empire, which included 1/4 of the world, whether measured in land or people, but also by its pressures and its actions against other nations. For example, the British Navy entered Brazilian waters in 1849 and destroyed Brazilian ships that had been used in the slave trade. The British government pressured the Ottoman Empire into banning the African slave trade, and later threatened to start boarding Ottoman ships in the Mediterranean if that empire did not do a better job of policing the ban.
Once again, do yourself a favor, pick up Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Pick that book up. I think he also has another one that addresses this issue. Intellectuals and Race, I think, touches on it a bit as well. But as far as I know, Black Rednecks, White Liberals does the deepest dive. And there are a lot of resources, a lot of sources listed.
Still later, Americans stamped out slavery in the Philippines. The Dutch stamped it out in Indonesia, the Russians in Central Asia, the French in their West African and Caribbean colonies. Germans in their East Africa colonies often hanged slave traders on the spot when they caught them in the act.
Goodness.
No non-Western nation or civilization shared this animosity towards slavery that began to develop in the Western world in the late 18th century, reached its peak in the 19th century, and continued to fuel the anti-slavery efforts that were still necessary in much of Africa and the Middle East on into the first half of the 20th century. This worldwide struggle went on for more than a century because the non-Western world in general resisted and evaded all efforts to get them to root out this institution that was an integral part of their economies and societies. When the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire first raised the issue of abolishing slavery with the Sultan in 1840, he reported this response.
Listen.
I have been heard with extreme astonishment, accompanied with a smile at a proposition for destroying an institution closely interwoven with the frame of society in this country, and intimately connected with the law and with the habits and even the religion of all classes, from the Sultan himself on down to the lowest peasant. Similarly, the Maoris of New Zealand responded to comments on their enslavement of some fellow Polynesians on other islands by saying, "We took possession in accordance with our customs, and we caught all the people. Not one escaped. Some ran away from us. These we killed, and others we killed. But what of that? It was in accordance with our customs."
And on a side note, it relates, but an aside a bit. The idea or the concept of the whole moral relativism, as far as people saying don't judge, there's no such thing as ultimate right or wrong. It's just a matter of what an individual society chooses to do. It sounds good to some, but that can never be lived out. And I guarantee you that those who promote that worldview, that idea, will not live that out consistently, because most of them, and rightfully so, will look into history and see the atrocities of the slave trade. They'll see the atrocities of Nazi Germany, and their hearts will break. But they have no groundwork, they have no foundation to be able to argue for that being wrong. Those who say that, morality is a social construct. They have no foundation for that. But those of us who hold to a biblical worldview can clearly point to the moral standard written on the heart and mind of every man. Romans chapter 2, all throughout Scripture, us being image bearers of God, we inherently know right from wrong. All throughout the book of Acts, we know right from wrong. We know that there is an ultimate moral standard, but only in a biblical framework can it really have solid legs to it. But you're just hearing about all the time, all the people that wanted to hold on to these issues. They wanted to hold on to the institution of slavery because it was a cultural thing. This is what we did. They talked about people they killed, and again, another point. So much for the peaceful, the noble savage. So much for that concept. Some people say that the majority of people that were enslaved in these African nations and some of these other Polynesian nations or in the Middle East, it was indentured servitude, and they were treated well. And I'm sure that there was some of that, but from what I've seen and what I've read and studied, that was not the majority case. You're talking about men having their testicles cut off, removed to keep them from procreating. Lord only knows. I don't even want to get into the things that were done to some of the women. That still goes on. That still happens today. But it just points to the fact that it wasn't that these people were just pure and utter victims in every situation who got involved in the slave trade. I'm not talking about the people who were enslaved. I'm talking about those who, some people look at a minority and can only look at a minority as a victim, and that's just ridiculous. Because once again, we know that any man can do evil. Any man, woman, child, even.
When British Foreign Secretary Palmerston sought in 1841 through his representative counsel, Atkins Hamilton, to get the ruler of Zanzibar to end the flourishing slave trade there, this was the response. When Palmerston continued to press for an end to the slave trade, Said pleaded that if he acceded to British demands, his subjects would withdraw their loyalty from him and support another claimant to the throne. And was he not looked up to by all Arabs generally as the person who should protect and guarantee for them their dearest interests, the right to carry on the slave trade? He reminded Hamilton that Arabs were not like the English and other European people who were always reading and writing and were unable to understand the anti-slavery viewpoint. The British obsession with it was quite inexplicable to them. In short, what was so patently wrong about slavery in the eyes of Western civilization of the past 2 centuries was almost incomprehensible to many non-Westerners.
They were dumbfounded. They couldn't understand why the West was so laser focused on ending the slave trade. They couldn't get it. And I think that to some degree that was largely due to a non-biblical worldview, understanding that we're all, as I mentioned earlier, image bearers of God, and that man stealing is wrong through Scripture, through the law of God. They didn't have a framework to really truly understand that. That's what I would think right offhand. Now, I could be wrong, or it could have been so ingrained in their culture that they just went along with it. And also because the question could be asked, like Thomas Sowell referenced earlier on in this book, in this chapter, he asked the question, why did it take so long for people to wake up and see the evils of slavery? And I think that there were some people who saw it as evil, but as far as a anti-slavery movement, why did it take so long? Because there were many people, to be fair, to be honest, there were many people who claimed to be Christian who held on to slaves. There were many people in the West who did that. And again, we're trying to be open and fair and honest and examine this issue as holistically as we can.
Eventually, some westernized elites or intellectuals in non-Western societies also became embarrassed about slavery. But these societies developed no such fervent anti-slavery movements as those which propelled successive European and European offshoot societies to ban this practice for themselves and to stamp it out, among others. In the Western world, hostility to slavery was by no means confined to elites. When a British ship stopped at Zanzibar in the 19th century, it was considered dangerous to let British sailors go ashore for fear that they would riot if they saw the slave market there.
Very
In
interesting.
the years leading up to the abolition of slavery in Brazil, soldiers and their officers no longer believed in the legitimacy of slavery, and so dragged their feet when assigned the task of recapturing runaway slaves. Soldiers continued to be sent to places where slaves were on the loose, but were not afraid to express their unwillingness to capture fugitives. The commander of an army unit sent to a community in Sao Paulo early in 1888 agreed to maintain order, but openly declined to capture slaves. In places runaways were loitering on the roads, refusing to work, army units sent to control them did nothing. Not all Brazilian soldiers refused orders to control or recaptured escaped slaves, but there was enough opposition to this role that a formal request was made to the civil authorities by the military, opinion increasingly hostile to the continuation of slavery, and many Brazilians keenly aware of and painfully embarrassed by the fact that their country was the last one in the Western world to still have slavery. The plantation owners were increasingly isolated, and some began freeing their slaves themselves in anticipation of official emancipation, and in some cases in hopes of retaining these workers as employees. Thus, when the official date of emancipation arrived in Brazil, most slaves were already free, either having been freed by plantation owners or having simply left the plantations on their own, secure in the knowledge that the surrounding population was not likely to cooperate in their recapture and return. Still, when the official day of emancipation arrived, it was a cause of national celebration. The novelist Machado de Assis recalled that the celebrations following the passage of the Golden Law were the only instance of popular delirium that I can remember ever having seen. One Sao Paulo newspaper described the crowds that gathered to celebrate. To try to describe the splendor of that festival of joy, to tell everything that happened, falls beyond our abilities. Never has this capital seen such multitudinous and unanimous enthusiasm. Perhaps at no other period of history was the contrast between the Western and the non-Western world greater. Here was the scene when the Ottoman Empire announced the end of the slave trade.
Pay attention.
In 1855, when the Sultan's firman was read out in Mecca and Jeddah, it caused a revolution. Turkish officials, including the Qadi who read the firman, were murdered, the garrison shut, and Mecca was in a state of revolt until the Porte repealed the obnoxious order. And when the Governor-General of the Hejaz issued orders on 25 February 1860 forbidding the slave trade in all Turkish ports in the Red Sea, there was great excitement and fear of the recurrence of the 1855 violence. There
Pretty wild, huh?
was no Ottoman cruiser in the Red Sea capable of giving effect to this order, and Turkish officials were too frightened to enforce it. Although the slave trade was formally abolished in the Ottoman Empire, under pressure from the British government, slavery itself continued.
Of course.
As of 1891, the imperial palace purchased 11 slave girls for its harem, as others in the Ottoman Empire purchased women as concubines, typically white women from a region near the Caucasus and the Black Sea, known as Circassia, even though every nation in the Western world had by then outlawed slavery. Not only the Turks accepted such slavery, so did the Circassians. Mothers often groomed their daughters for this role and sold them into what was considered to be a desirable situation, at least by comparison with what was available in Circassia. British Foreign Secretary Palmerston said, "The only complaint we have ever heard from the Circassians has been against our attempts to stop the traffic."
My goodness. Pretty wild, y'all. Pretty wild. I think that's a good place to wrap things up for today. I believe tomorrow should be part 2. But again, some pretty shocking information. If you're new to this, you may not really know what to do with it. But do your homework. Once again, pick up the book, Black Rednecks, White Liberals by Thomas Sowell, and do some additional research on your own. Again, this is the end of part 1. We'll pick it up where we left off. And I'll probably keep every episode to around 45 minutes, just so you don't get overwhelmed with too much data too soon. But man, oh man, y'all, there was so much more complexity to the issue of slavery. So much more. It's not as simple. And man, when I say that, I'm just thinking about some of the data that's coming up. The slave issue is extremely complex, and sometimes, as evil and as horrific as it is, and it wasn't always as simple as cut these people loose and send them on their way. There were a lot of much deeper concerns at the time. But again, I appreciate y'all joining me today. Stay tuned. I'll post, if you follow me on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you follow me, I'll post a link for part 2 tomorrow, or maybe the day after. Not 100% sure, but just keep your eyes peeled for my content. If you notice, I've been making a video, seeking to make a video every day, putting out some content every day. I'm trying to get monetized, y'all, so I can really go all in with YouTube. So if you'll do me a favor, just start watching more of my content so I can build up my watch hours. You're supposed to get like 4,000 hours of watch time in order to get monetized. And I think I'm somewhere around 1,500. So I need quite a few more hours of watch time. So if you could take some time and maybe binge watch some of my content, I wouldn't be mad at all. The sooner I get monetized, the sooner I can, I'm not sure what kind of income or what kind of earnings I'll get from that, but it'll definitely help me be able to put more time into creating content, getting some better equipment so I can serve you guys that much better. But again, this is the end of episode 1. Stay tuned for episode 2 very, very soon. God bless.